Welcome to First Person. I'm Lisa Van Dusen, and today I'm talking with Scott Sagan, who's a professor at Stanford University in political science. He is the Caroline S.G. Monroe Professor of Political Science at Stanford University and a senior fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation, which is known as CISAC, and the Freeman Spokane Institute. So I could go on with more titles, but we would run out of time to talk today. So welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Lisa.
And the first question I wanted to ask you is really about how you got interested in what you do. And you do two things. You teach undergraduates and graduate students, and then you work in arms
control, disarmament, nuclear weapons, nuclear power, and proliferation.
So what was the seed of your interest in those things, and was there any sort of childhood experience that was a moment or a contributing factor?
Childhood experience. Childhood experience was perhaps best. What would explain it for me would be that my grandfather was the Methodist Bishop of India, of northern India, during the partition period. So he told me stories about war and peace and the importance of doing action. I wanted to become an academic, but after getting my PhD, decided to spend some time working in the government. So I went from the ivory tower of Harvard to a windowless room in the basement of the Pentagon. And for 2 years worked on nuclear weapons issues from an operational perspective, as what are we targeting, how many do we need for the sake of deterrence, what do the Russians really think about this, can we have cuts or can we have some kinds of controls. I didn't want to stay inside the government. I wanted to get back to doing academic research. But what it meant for me was that experience taught me that the government needs scholarship on ideas. Scholars don't make the policy decisions, but we can provide information, theories, and evidence that can inform and help make government officials smarter when they make the decisions they do. So this center, and much of my work, is dedicated to the idea that scholarship should not just be for the sake of the university or for the sake of improving our general knowledge. It should be applied into government settings or international organization settings and be helpful in that way.
Can you tell a little bit about what goes on here? CSEC is one of the centers at the Freeman Spokane Institute.
Sure.
So what are some of the kinds of things that go on here? Well,
CSEC is an interdisciplinary center of Stanford faculty and researchers. You should think about it as an independent think tank within the university that provides evidence through hearings, through published works, through government consulting to the government, and it's something that the faculty here do on a part-time basis. We all teach. We still do our own academic research, but we take some of it and apply it to big problems in the world today. And when it comes to nuclear weapons or nuclear arms control or how can we spread nuclear power without it leading to further states getting nuclear weapons, those are huge issues, and this center is right in the middle of that.
So how does the government feel about it? Do they want your research? Do they want your opinions? Are they hungry for that?
Oh, very much so. A center like CSEC at Stanford influences the government in a number of ways. Sometimes it's through being asked to serve on a commission or being asked to testify in front of Congress. At other times, it's because you've written something that will influence the public debate about an issue, about whether we should attack Iran or not attack Iran, whether we should have an arms control agreement with the Russians to cut numbers further, or whether that would be dangerous or unnecessary. And then sometimes CSEC scholars influence the government by going into the government. So I'll give you some examples. Joseph Felter, Stanford PhD, recently retired U.S. Army colonel, is doing research on whether, one way to think about it is whether our efforts to try to reduce non-combatant killings, accidental collateral damage killings in the war in Afghanistan, whether it's really helping our cause or whether it doesn't really matter. And by using really powerful statistical methods and new data that he was able to get, in part because of his experience working in Afghanistan for the U.S. military, he was able to show quite conclusively, in a very compelling manner, that our efforts to show what's called courageous restraint and not shoot if there's any concern that you're going to kill innocent civilians, to reduce the number of collateral damage killings, has actually reduced Taliban recruitment in those areas in which we've had more restraint, and the areas where we have had less restraint, the opposite occurs.
India and Pakistan. You mentioned
Right.
that was a very important reason for your interest in the first
Sure.
place. So what stands out for you in the work that you've done there? And briefly, because we're going to, again,
Sure.
as I said, keep moving around.
In 1998, India and Pakistan tested nuclear weapons, and soon thereafter, the U.S. government made a decision that U.S. government officials can't really talk to the Indians and Pakistanis about their nuclear weapons programs and can't help them make them safer and more secure, because that was deemed to be a violation of the non-proliferation treaty for us to help other countries who are not considered appropriate nuclear weapons holders. And therefore, I led a team of CSEC researchers and some others to go to Pakistan and talk to the Pakistani military and their civilian leaders about how the United States adjusted our programs to avoid some of the mistakes that I've mentioned before during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we showed up in Islamabad and briefed them on the personnel reliability programs, the psychological tests that we give people, the nuclear emergency search teams that we set up in case something goes wrong, so special teams can go out and get a weapon and dismantle it, and they're taught how to do that.
So all the practices.
All the practices, the best things they could do. Otto von Bismarck once said, "A wise man does not learn from his mistakes. A wise man learns from other people's mistakes." And so we were trying to do that, and I think that was another example of how we could do that. We brought in U.S. officials, former ambassadors and the like, and after 9/11, the U.S. government said, "It's really good that you've done this," because now, after 9/11, they decided to start doing some of this themselves, and they switched their policy. So again, the work done here with my colleagues, CSEC was able to, in this sense, prepare the Pakistanis and train them on some practices that I think were helpful.
So Iran and Israel.
Right.
Can you articulate kind of from a 30,000 foot up view what's going on between Israel and Iran, and then how, to the extent you'd like to, Obama, Romney, and I will say, as to my fellow Michigander, Willard, Mitt Romney, not George.
Not George Romney.
How they fit in, and particularly this whole business of having nuclear arms versus having capability.
Right.
So
it's a very complicated situation. The Iranians have, in my judgment, used the non-proliferation treaties section that lets people who say they will not get nuclear weapons can acquire nuclear power. And that's part of the treaty, that's part of the deal in the treaty. They have developed nuclear power in a way deliberately designed, in my view, to give them the option of getting weapons. So they can claim they still have inspectors on the facilities that are enriching uranium, but they can claim that they're not getting nuclear weapons. They're clearly working on them. We've uncovered that. The IAEA has uncovered that. And the question is, how far can they go before either the IAEA declares that something's been taken out of the enrichment facilities, or they kick the inspectors out, which would be a sure sign they're going for weapons, or how much material can they accumulate before the United States or Israel says enough is enough, we're going to use military force. In my judgment, the military option is a very unattractive option.
And you talk about that in your Nature
I talk about that
piece in July.
Correct.
This year.
Mostly because no matter how large the military attack would be, not only would it be very costly in terms of spreading problems throughout the world, but it's very unlikely that we'd be able to do more than delay the Iranians for another year or two. At the same time, I think Iran getting nuclear weapons would be a disaster too. Some people say if other countries get nuclear weapons, it's ethnocentric or even racist for us to think they can't get them and control them when we can. And my view is we had a lot of close calls. We don't want other countries to go through that. Moreover, some of the countries that have acquired nuclear weapons recently have thought about them as shields behind which they can take more aggressive action.
That was a really interesting part of the piece you wrote.
Well, thank you. We have, for example, recently gotten the transcripts of Saddam Hussein's tapes talking to his own generals and his party officials. He, like John F. Kennedy, liked to tape, or like Richard Nixon, liked to tape all of his conversations.
It's probably not so popular now.
Not so popular now. Saddam did that and would talk about what will happen when we get the bomb. Because
basically what you're saying is it's licensed to do anything because you're the bully.
You're the bully, and other countries that have a nuclear weapon can't use them against you if push comes to shove, because then they'll have retaliation. So he viewed this as a shield and talks in these transcripts about once we get the bomb, we can attack Israel, and we may not get to Tel Aviv, but we can take back all of the occupied territories. We may lose 50,000 martyrs, but Israel won't. But it's worth it. And Israel won't be able to use a nuclear weapon against us because they know that we'd have a nuclear weapon to destroy them. And I fear, and that's true in Pakistan too. Remember in Pakistan, they get the bomb in '98, and in '99 they sneak a whole bunch of soldiers into Indian-held Kashmir. And they disguise them as mujahideen, and they claim that that these aren't our soldiers, but we now know, and the Indians knew at the time, that that's exactly what they had done. And they did that in part thinking that India now can't retaliate because Pakistan has the bomb. So nuclear weapons, not only are there problems of safety and security and accidents, but there are also these other problems that they may make some countries more aggressive. So to me, so what do we do? Well, partly,
what do we do?
Well, right now this is in part in the hands of Israel. Israel may decide that it's getting too close, that Iran's getting too close, and decide to launch a preventive attack on their own. They've done it twice, once against Iraq and once against Syria. In both cases they did it when there was just one reactor that was not operating yet. So this would be a very, very different kind of operation and a much riskier one. The other option is for the United States to use military force. Obama has said, in order to discourage Israel from attacking, that if Iran gets the bomb, we will not permit that.
But we have to define what that means. And
Obama does not want to define what that means, because not only would that tempt Iran to go right up to the edge, but it would lock Obama in on a technicality. So if he said it is when Iran gets enough material for one bomb's worth, which some people think they're already there, is it when they get enriched above 20%?
But the point is, that technicality. So really, everyone's trying to get technical, and on the other hand, they're really trying not to. So
they're trying to be very careful not to lock themselves in.
Everybody.
Yes. And the Israelis would like the Americans to have a stricter red line, and the Americans are resisting that at this period of time. My own hope, but this is just a hope, and it's by no means a certainty, is that there can be some kind of negotiated deal where the Iranians could actually set their own limits. That is, that we agree not to enrich up to a certain level, and we agree that this is going to be the limits, and in exchange for that, we can perhaps reduce some of the sanctions. But in the Bush administration, they said they don't want to have any Iranian capabilities at all. But if the alternative to Iran having some kind of latent capability, some materials that they say would be for nuclear power, but could be used for weapons in the future, if the alternative to them having that is a war, I prefer that enrichment alternative. On the other hand, I don't want to see them go all the way to get the bomb.
So You've talked a little bit about the non-proliferation treaty.
One of the most important treaties
Right.
in our security, and people don't know much about it.
I mean, this may seem like a dumb question, but so fundamentally, why is it that we insist on having nuclear arms ourselves, yet we don't want other people to have them? Like, we are not leading by example.
Right. We are not doing a good job of leading by example, but I think the current administration has actually made this a point of pride in what it's trying to do.
Moving in the right direction.
Correct. The Non-Proliferation Treaty contains many clauses, as you'd expect from a complicated international treaty with 189 members in it. But the basic deal is this, that is, the countries that have nuclear weapons when it was signed agreed that we're not going to help our friends get nuclear weapons. And we agree that we will work in good faith towards the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. The non-nuclear weapon states agreed that they're not going to seek nuclear weapons from their friends or covertly, and that if they get nuclear power, which they can under the treaty, they're going to let inspectors on to ensure the international community that they're not cheating. Now, those inspectors are in part how we found out about Iran cheating, and certainly how we found out about North Korea cheating. So even though there have been cheaters, they were exposed because of the inspection systems to a significant degree. So it's a very important treaty, and the non-nuclear weapon states repeatedly have said, well, okay, most of us are keeping our side of the bargain, and you're not doing enough. And so what Obama did in the famous Prague speech soon after the election is to lay out for the world that he's recommitting the United States to work in good faith towards the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. He said, this is going to take a long time, and the United States can't do it alone, and as long as other countries have nuclear weapons, the United States will have nuclear weapons too. But he said, we're going to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in our own policy, so we won't depend on them as much, and we're going to seek gradual reductions. So the first set of reductions, bringing the United States down to 1,500, was done in a mutual way with the Russians, and that was ratified by the U.S. Senate, and that's the law of the land now. And so we're actually doing that, and very soon we'll be down to that number. And Obama has said that he wants to continue, if he's reelected, and have another round of negotiations to lead to even deeper cuts. I see three potential uses of nuclear weapons as being the most likely ones in the world today. The first is in Pakistan. If there's another terrorist attack coming from Pakistani soil into India, like the Mumbai attack or the attack in Delhi, I think there's going to be a danger that India will this time decide to retaliate. And if they retaliate, especially if they send troops into Pakistan, the Pakistanis have threatened that they're going to use nuclear weapons in a limited manner very early on. The Indians say that if you use nuclear weapons against Indian troops, even if they're inside Pakistani soil, that we're going to have a full-scale retaliation against Pakistan. The Pakistanis say the Indians are bluffing. The Indians say the Pakistanis are bluffing. So the first scary scenario is that we find out that neither of them are bluffing and could lead to a nuclear war. The second danger would be if a terrorist gets enough material to make a uranium-based bomb or steals a bomb itself from one of the nuclear weapon states' arsenals.
Ready-made.
Ready-made. I don't think the terrorist could make no terrorist organization that I've ever studied has the technical capability to enrich uranium or produce plutonium. They might be able to make a primitive bomb if they get somebody else's uranium or plutonium, but especially uranium is easier. Or if they get a ready-made bomb. And the idea of trying to use deterrence to stop a terrorist from using the weapon just doesn't make much sense at all. Terrorists may want retaliation against whatever country, or may feel that it doesn't matter, they're trying to set off a major disaster. And certainly in some cases you wouldn't even know where the weapon came from, so you wouldn't even know how to respond. And the third, I would say, is that I think this is true about all nuclear weapon states, but something we have to be very, very careful about is there have been times where nuclear weapon states feel that they want to use their nuclear weapons to try to stop somebody else from doing something in the conventional area or with chemical or biological weapons.
So they feel kind of ethically empowered somehow?
I think they just feel desperate and have overconfidence. So our policy until very recently in the United States was to say that if another country uses chemical or biological weapons against us, that we might use nuclear weapons in response. And the plus side of that is that might add an extra element of deterrence for somebody thinking about using chemical and biological weapons. The downside,
on the other hand,
is that if that happens, then an American president and or whatever leader has made that kind of threat is going to feel an extra pressure, something I've called the commitment trap problem. That you think that this can help, and it might, but if it fails, then you've got a lot of pressure to follow through on your threats for the sake of long-term credibility or for the sake of political authority at home. The Obama administration has quite wisely, as part of this effort to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. policy, has gotten largely away from that policy and has pledged in 2010 that if a country that's in good standing with the non-proliferation treaty gets into a conflict with us or one of our allies, even if they use a chemical or biological weapons, we're not going to use nuclear weapons in response. That we will hold the leaders of that country responsible for what they've done, and they will suffer enormous punishment for what they have done. But we promise that we would not use nuclear weapons. I think that's a much wiser policy. Not all countries have adopted that policy, and the United States certainly could reverse itself in the future. But I think that 2010 Obama administration policy under what was called the Nuclear Posture Review was a wise move to make.
So I'd like to shift gears a little bit, because you're really talking about leadership now, and we've got all these very complicated, fraught situations around the world, and you're talking about what you hope happens and the direction that you hope we move, and that we are moving in some regards.
Right.
What are the leadership, I'm kind of getting at your teaching, a combination of your teaching and kind of what leadership qualities are in order in our world today. So you can approach that whichever way you want, but maybe starting with kind of what the qualities of the leaders are that we need, and then shift to your teaching and how you hope you're developing those.
Well, we need leaders who are very open to fact-based decision-making and make decisions not based on faith, but by, as a good scholar would, trying to take the evidence, even if it's surprising and leads you to conclusions different than your initial assumptions, to follow the evidence to see where it leads you and make the best decisions according to what evidence is available. There'll still be uncertainty, but one needs to have that. And I'm very pleased at the number of people coming through the CSEC program. But at the undergraduate level and for graduate students, I think that you can actually help people understand how what they're learning can be useful later on in life by giving them some new skills. So for example, in our large International Security in a Changing World lecture class, we do a simulation of a non-proliferation treaty review conference where every student is given a role to play, be it the U.S. ambassador to the treaty, or the Pakistani observer team, or the Iranian delegation. And we often try to get people outside their own intellectual box.
So they are literally in someone else's shoes.
They're literally in somebody else's shoes. Well, not literally, we let them wear their own shoes, but they are figuratively in someone else's shoes. And we design this often to encourage them to think about the other side's perspective on this. To not do what Americans too often do, which is if we talk louder and repeat ourselves about our interests, people will see that what's in our interest is what's in their interest. Not true. You've got to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, and make compromises. That's what diplomacy is about. So in these negotiations, simulated negotiations, I've often asked a Israeli student to play the Iranian ambassador, or to ask a American student to play the Russian ambassador.
So you're not having people choose numbers. You are curating
Oh yes, very much so.
process
Very much so.
to optimize learning
Yes, indeed. So
and maybe drama.
Well, it adds to the drama, but it also really very much helps them appreciate this. We've had a American of Indian descent play the Pakistani prime minister in one simulation about trying to get rid of nuclear weapons. And for him to realize why Pakistan is interested in having nuclear weapons and why a Pakistani leader is reluctant to give them up provided, I think, an important ray of understanding for him, and that was, I think, extremely valuable. I know for me, I watched these fake negotiations, these simulated negotiations, and I learned a lot. It helps me also understand some of the dynamics involved. About 6 years ago now, Chip Blacker, the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute, and I went to Russia and gathered together students from 17 Russian universities, and brought along some Stanford students with us to do this process in Russia.
Interesting.
And the Americans played the Russian delegation. The Russians played the Iranians, the Israelis, everybody but. And this was a UN Security Council meeting to say, should we have sanctions on Iran? And so it was very interesting to see the Russians have to get out of their box of saying it's all the U.S. fault and to defend the United States for that small team. The other teams playing the French and the British to learn those perspectives.
Do you see these students taking an approach that is different from world leaders?
Well, frankly, students sometimes start the process with a naive view that can't we all just get along? And part of the process of going through a simulation like this is to learn that there are actual conflicts of interest. And there are bureaucratic hurdles to making agreements, and there are domestic political problems, with one side saying you're going too far and the other side saying you're not going far enough. So understanding those will encourage students to both know that, like good political leaders or good military leaders, they have to know the facts, and we'll give them a little bit of empathy, not necessarily sympathy, but some empathy for the difficulty that countries have in making agreements in this arena.
And you've done that with undergraduates through sophomore college.
Correct.
Course that you just completed, both in Gettysburg and Little Bighorn. So you've done that in historical as well as real time. I might have one little more question. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to say about sort of the road not taken for you. I mean, is there anything that you could imagine doing besides what you're doing?
I sometimes wonder what would have happened had I stayed inside the government. And I was in a very low position inside the Pentagon, but there are lots of opportunities to stay in. And that would have certainly made me feel like I was more directly influencing the government. But what I do now both fulfills my need for doing research, which I just love doing. It's so exciting when you find new facts and you write them up. And my love of research is very, very strong. I like teaching. And if I can use both of those skills to influence the government indirectly, I feel that's a real contribution, and it makes me very satisfied.